So I wish I could say this is still an exploratory paper. It's not supposed to be, but I am very open to comments, suggestions, questions, thoughts, all of those beautiful things. If there are clarification questions during my presentation, feel free to ask, but I would like to hold most of the questions and comments for the end of the presentation, just to not get backtracked. But if there's something pressing, feel free to ask, and I will feel free to get back to the presentation if I feel we're drifting off. So thank you very much, Catherine, and I finally get to do the PARCC Conversation in Conflict Studies series, which I've been trying to do for, I think, a year now, and thanks Boone also for putting up with the rescheduling. Today's topic is called Vision, Voice, and Technology. Is there a global open government trend? And how this paper came about was basically by me reading more and more in various documents from international organizations about what a great thing open government is. And instinctively, I agree. But more and more, I had the question, well, what is this thing, open government, actually about? So as you can see, for example, the OECD calls it a culture of governance based on innovative and sustainable public policies and practices inspired by the principles of transparency, accountability, participation that fosters democracy and inclusive growth. So quite a mouthful, right? And if you look across other organizations, so the World Bank has an Open Government Solutions Group that it's founded recently. There's the Open Government Partnership, which since 2011, a bunch of countries have joined to advance principle of transparency, accountability, participation, what I call all the beautiful things. So open government is kind of everywhere, and it is being held up as a kind of new governance paradigm, so kind of like the new good governance. Now, if we look at open government plans that countries set up, whether as part of the Open Government Partnership or not, they tend to focus on transparency, open data, using online tools, so ICT-mediated transparency. So all this talk about open government led me with the question, okay, even if it's being hailed as a new governance paradigm, is there really a global open government trend? Of course, the question might seem simple, but it gets very complicated very quickly because I realized telling whether there's an open government revolution is difficult because A, we lack a definition, and the measurement is very challenging and very hard to get around. So, what are possible definitions of open government? Now, as I said at the beginning, there's both in the academic literature and in international, if you want, practice, including open government plans. It tends to be associated with a bunch of new tools and technologies. I mentioned open data. For example, the use of social media by government to interact with citizens more is also often counted as a form of open government or as as something that advances open government. Now, more not necessarily rigorous, but if you want wide-reaching definitions or conceptual definition, define open government as a combination of more vision and more voice for citizens in government. And this is actually also close to the core idea of open, because me not being a native English speaker, and I start getting confused about a word, I go to the Oxford English Dictionary. And the Oxford English Dictionary defines open as allowing access and or vision. So essentially, open government, openness is about giving citizens both more voice in government, so increasing citizen participation, and more vision, so to say. So better information, better knowledge about what government does and why. Now, as I said, the new open government discourse does have a relatively heavy tech focus. So you could say technology is supposed to amplify both of those things, both vision and voice. Of course, this definition don't really answer the question, well, what's the relationship between open government and open state, which is a term that the OECD uses, and the open society more broadly. And open society, if anybody remembers, that's a Karl Popper term about a society where people exchange ideas freely, right? Now, if you go even farther and get even more ambitious about this whole conceptual stuff, democracy is, by definition, the political system that allows the most voice and vision for citizens, right? And if you look at the arguments for the openness, for more open government, and especially for using more open government tools, including the techno-optimistic arguments about how new technology will transform the way government works and interacts with citizens, you see that openness tools are meant to enhance, not supplant democratic institutions. Whether that's the case, I think still remains an open question that I might talk a little bit more about in the presentation. Now, how did we get here? And I looked, well, in the paper I look at both US and global terms in one. Here in the presentation I split them up. But essentially you can think of it as a bunch of streams that came together in this openness discourse. So you have transparency and advocacy for government transparency. So initially open government in the US was tied to the Freedom of Information Act and to open meeting laws. Back in the 60s, actually it started in the 50s. And the framing was about democratic rights and accountability, so the people have a right to know what's going on in the government. Participation wasn't that closely tied to discourse, at least more recently, even though, as you can see, originally the open government discourse, so for example, through open meeting law, did acknowledge that information is not that useful unless somebody does something with it, so to say. And the way to get citizens to use this information or to interact with government more was through setting up various systems of participation. Now, technology and the technological discourse of openness, in a sense, brings both transparency and participation back together through the vision of openness in interactive terms. So a lot of the new open government discourse comes from I call them tech communities if you want, but is related to, for example, the idea of open source software, where the code is public enough and everybody can reuse and improve pieces of that. Open data, for example, it's not just simply about putting information out there, but putting highly disaggregated data out there in formats that allow easy reuse by, basically whoever wants to use it. Fun terms are hacktivists or digital citizens, and there's a bunch of other terms. But the idea behind that is that the public or entrepreneurs will use public data, if it's offered in the right format, to create new apps or to better hold government to account. So in a sense, this technology-based idea of openness in interactive terms brings transparency and participation back together. But there's a risk that it might depoliticize both by shifting from a rights-based discourse to a tools-based discourse. Now, if you look at the global level, it's a little bit similar, except a little bit later. So if you're on the global transparency revolution, if we're talking dramatically here, also started with a Freedom of Information Act, but more in the 90s. And now you could call FOIA essentially a global norm, right? So more than 110 countries have some kind of Freedom of Information Act. Of course, if that actually works or not, and the difference between in law and in practice can be debated. And I have a picture that we can look at and debate. But while FOIAs, in a sense, are widespread and they're great as an idea, they haven't achieved miracles anywhere, right? So all of these tools, whether analog or online, whether legal or of another nature, are inherently limited to some degree if it's about opening up government more broadly to citizens. But one of the critiques of FOIA is that it represents a form of reactive rather than proactive transparency. So basically, citizens need to know what kind of information to request, need to go through often quite bureaucratic channels to get to the information, and there's a bunch of hurdles. So also at the global level, if you want, the next wave of openness or transparency advocacy has centered around the proactive release of data by governments in a variety of areas. There's, again, everybody who knows me knows I like acronyms, or I'm so used to them that I bring them up all the time. I'm not sure which one it is. But you have a bunch of multi-stakeholder initiatives or international NGOs that advocate for data release, prepare indexes and rankings, and share information and lessons learned on how to release more information to the public in a variety of areas. So you have the International Budget Partnership, which is the oldest one, which does the Open Budget Index. You have the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, the International Aid Transparency Initiative, the Global Initiative on Fiscal Transparency, the Construction Sector Transparency Initiative, the Open Contracting Partnership. Apparently you also have a Fisheries Transparency Initiative that I know nothing about. The logic behind them is similar. So saying, well, if citizens, if this data, if transparency, one of the main purposes is to help citizens hold government to account, then you need to, governments need to disclose more data on these areas where we want to hold them to account, right? So budgets, extractive industries, very tough to do, aid, and so on and so forth. Now, with the kind of new openness discourse, the open data community has also kind of emerged and added to it in a sense. So you have also NGOs that put together open data rankings. Those are more recent, but for example, the Open Data Barometer or the Global Open Data Index kind of do something similar as the International Budget Partnership or the Open Budget Index for budgets, specifically looking at data in a variety of areas in a well-defined format that counts as open. Now, as I said, in a sense, this technologically based idea of openness has brought transparency and participation back together to some degree under the guise of using various technological tools to advance both. And since 2003, the United Nations is publishing an e-participation index. And I already mentioned the Open Government Partnership, which since 2011 kind of has been founded in 2011 and now has about 70-something countries as members. In principle, it looks great, right? So you have more and more openness initiatives in more and more sectors, more and more countries are joining in these initiatives. But does that make a difference? As I said, that's very hard to say, so I'm very tentatively trying here to find an answer. But just looking even at the most basic hope of this initiative is that governments, at least in this area that are up here, will start using the new tools or following the new guidelines for releasing information. Has that happened based on what we have? Well, the answer seems to be not so much, right? So if you look at the open budget score, the global average, and these are all global averages, which come, I know, with some serious disadvantages when it comes to analyzing data in more disaggregated formats. But, you know, if you're talking about, is there a global open government trend? The question is, did the average measure of open government increase globally, right? The global average measure of government openness increase. So if you look at the open budget score, you can see it has essentially barely budged, right? So there was a small dip after 2006, and it's slightly recovered ever since, but 2015 level were still basically below 2016 level. If you look at open data, and there's different dimensions of open data that the Open Data Barometer catches, but essentially, the open data implementation measures whether governments release a number of data sets in open formats. And you can see this has also barely budged at all. Granted, that's only a very short time frame, but essentially, there doesn't seem to be much of a dramatic change at all there. Conversely, if you look at open data leaders, for example, like the United States, which clearly has a very high score. But even there, in this short time frame data, you actually see a regress in open data implementation. Don't ask me to explain this, because I'm not investigating that in detail. But the point is that it sends kind of a signal and a warning. So first of all, the progress hasn't been as dramatic as we would hope for. And second of all, the progress can be very easily undone. Now, the one good news is the UN e-participation index, right? Where you see the clearest increase in e-participation scores across countries. Now, by e-participation, what they mean is again, a bunch of tools that governments can use, for example, to inform or consult citizens. So open data would fall under e-information. Conducting online polls, for example, would fall under e-consultation. I think e-decision making is much rarer and more of a conceptual idea. But I'm not sure if, for example, the crowdsourcing the Icelandic constitution would fall into the e-decision making or e-consultation category. But the idea is basically using online tools to inform or consult citizens. Their measurement approach is also a bit interesting because essentially they're trying to take into account the fact that technology evolves, right? So new tools are appearing all the time. So how do you design an index over time that captures all of these things? Well, the way they did it is to basically use a kind of best practices approach to measurement. And again, don't ask me about the formula because I don't have it. But the basic idea is that every year they look at the best practices in e-participation that the most advanced countries used, and then based on that, they develop a kind of comparative scale or comparative index that they kind of classify all the countries on. Theoretically, that can be interpreted positively. So if the bar is continuously set higher and more countries are getting closer to the bar, it means that e-participation is kind of catching fire. No, bad metaphor. It's catching on everywhere, so to say. But even these measures don't really tell us whether that information, for example, or the decisions that citizens take in e-participation fora are actually respected by governments, or what happens with the result of the constitution, or does all of this have any substantive impact on government behavior? So measuring actual government behavior, so whether governments are really more open beyond just using these online tools, is obviously very hard because you have to observe a myriad of interaction between citizens and government, which are not really observable. Some smart people have tried to find ways around it or get closer to it. So one approach for measuring transparency specifically, so the vision part, is to look at the data that governments report, that macroeconomic and social macroaggregate data that governments collect and then report to international organizations. And that data is centralized in the World Bank's World Development Indicators database. So what Hollier, Rosendorf, and Vreeland did is essentially look at the data that's in that database, and based on that, construct an index that basically captures how much data each country reported each year that's included in the database. And they use that as a proxy for transparency. Granted, it's not a perfect proxy for many reasons, but it's also objective data in a sense, unlike the indicators that we've looked at earlier, so like the open budget survey, which is more based on subjective assessments. Now, if you look at the evolution of this data over time, and the good thing is we can go as far back as the 1980s, you do see an increase. But the increase is, at least for me, maybe I was for once being overly optimistic. It doesn't happen often. At least for me, the increase doesn't really seem that dramatic, right? And not only that, so this is kind of the overall trends, and this is the year-to-year changes. You can see that actually the global average of data release has decreased since since 2005, essentially. So while the regress isn't dramatic, there does seem to be a slight regress there, right? Now, as I said, this is a very limited measure of transparency, and since I like conceptual questions and I like transparency, I tend to go very deeply into debating what that actually means. So I couldn't, okay, we're going to jump over this, but we can come back to this later, because I think I'm talking too much again. So without getting too deeply into conceptual debates about what transparency actually means, one essential point is that it's not just about the release of information or the release of data, because that measures the release of data and a specific kind of data that might not be even that directly relevant to citizens. But transparency is basically seeing what's going on inside government. Remember the open door on the first slide where I was presenting the definition. It's understanding how government decisions are made. And this is not just about releasing data to the public, it's also about giving reasons for your decisions, so the justification of decisions on the one hand, and on the other hand, and this is, I think, the most ambitious definition of transparency, it's about how predictable and transparent public decisions are made. So essentially, whether there's a system of laws that make it clear how decisions are made and that are respected, so it creates a certain degree of predictability in public behavior. Now, here are the two proxies for these two measures of transparency. They come from a relatively new project that measures a bunch of aspects of democracy or components on democracy. And we're going to spend a bit of time with these also when talking about participation. But essentially, they have two measures. One is a measure about whether governments give public and reasoned justification of their policy choices based on appeals to the common good. So this is a form of, if you want, communicative transparency or transparent communication. And the other measure is whether decisions are made, so government acts, decisions are made based on clear, well-publicized, coherent, stable laws that are predictably enforced. So you could call this, if you want, transparent laws, even though I'm not sure that that's the best moniker. I like also to call it as transparency as predictability in behavior. And you can see in both of these cases, the changes are more dramatic than in the cases of information transparency. But the basic idea and the pattern is kind of the same. So the spike is in the early 90s. And I keep saying in my classes, the 90s are the best decade. I might be biased, but here you have the graph. So it's a spike in the early 90s. Some sustained growth since, but basically after, and here it's 2010, you can also see a regress in both of these categories, or in both of these types of transparency. Now, this is the vision part. This is essentially as good as or as far as I managed to get in how do we measure transparency in a reasonable way across countries. Participation, obviously, and if we want to look at the even longer term and see even more pronounced patterns, one of the advantages of the Varieties of Democracy project is that it actually goes back to the 1900s. And in a sense, the patterns are very obvious, right? The dips are world wars. The increases are when there are waves of democratization. So, spoiler alert, I'm going to say this again later on, but essentially both transparency and participation, so both vision and voice, increase during periods of democratization, which shouldn't be surprising, but does raise a few questions. Now, moving on. How much time do I have left? Is there plenty? Okay. Well, then I can keep talking. So, going to the other part of openness, the voice part, the participation part. As I said, democracy is the political system that by design tries to maximize citizens' voice in decision-making, right? But democracy has its limits, and it seems to be having more and more limits these days, right? So you have all kinds of worries about democratic deconsolidations. People are participating less and less through traditional channels in consolidated advanced democracy. So voting, participation in voting or voting percentages are going down. There's increased polarization, decreasing trust in governments, all those things that ail us and worry us, right? So a lot of the discourse on transparency and participation, both the new kind and the old kind, in essence meant to try to remedy these, if you want, limitations of democracy, right? So voting is clearly not enough because you do that once every 4 years or once every 2 years or depending on the system. It is not that easy to kind of hold elected officials to account. There is a myriad of public decisions, all of which necessitate some degree of public input if you want to do them right. So, in addition to that, you have advocates of more direct participation. I think we have some of them in PARCC here. And again, that can take many forms, but the Varieties of Democracy project has essentially put together an indicator that combines the degree of direct democracy, so basically the use of referenda, political decentralization. I can explain, it's debatable, but it is included there, as well as actual consultation of civil society in decision-making. It also looks at whether the environment for civil society organizations is actually conducive. And I talk about civil society organizations, again, debatable in many ways, how constructive or not constructive they are everywhere. But the basic idea is that, again, traditional systems of representations exclusively through political parties are not enough. And what matters is, not bowling alone, so to say. So having a myriad of other organizations that involve citizens and mediate between them and the state. So the Varieties of Democracy project also assesses whether the environment for civil society has improved or not, and specifically it looks at barriers to entry and repression and the degree of CSO independence from government. Again, you can see that the patterns are very similar with what we've seen before. So the dramatic increases are in the early 90s, respectively, the dips are World War II. And basically all of these measures kind of increase in parallel, with the caveat that, if the environment of civil society seems to have been consistently better than the actual degree of electoral democracy, but not necessarily the degree of actual citizen involvement or consultation in government. And we'll see this pattern also repeat itself. This is basically just another way of visualizing the same graphs, because I can't decide sometimes what the best visualization is. The nice thing about this is that you can see spikes, so you can see when the dramatic improvements are, it hits you more immediately. Now, talked about civil society organizations. I'm one of those people, even though I realize we need to be somewhat critical and careful when judging them, I do think an active civil society is very important for a democratic polity. So digging deeper in looking at participation, at this specific dimension of participation, the degree to which civil society organizations are active and consulted in government decision-making, again, not to bore you, spoiler alert, the patterns are the same, but you can also see some interesting things here, I think. Which is, while, before the 90s, all these measures used to be fairly close to each other. After the 90s, you had this dramatic spike, but while the repression of CSOs and the restriction on entry and exit have eased a lot, so governments are less repressive, essentially, of CSOs, the actual level of CSO consultation and CSO independence has increased, but not so much, so has increased less. Now, to me, this suggests, and you're free to disagree and debate, to me this suggests that there's also a gap in the potential for consultation and involvement of civil society organizations versus the actual consultation and involvement. And as you can see, CSO consultation is the one that also has gone very clearly down roughly the same period after the 2010s. Again, the squiggly lines are just so you can see the spikes more dramatically. But essentially, what does this tell us? So I'd say there are some clear patterns that are discernible there. The starting question was, is there a global openness revolution? Clearly, you could say since the 1980s, yes, and especially in the early 1990s. But also, it is also correct that it has changed a lot since the early 1900s. But since the 2000s, it's less than expected, and not only that, there seems to be a slight regress, despite the increasing take-up of these online tools for, e-participation, e-consultation, e-information, Now, what does it mean exactly? So, I do think I emphasized all of these, or I explained all of this so far, so this is essentially a summary of it. And again, you've seen, I think, in the graphs, and it also stands to reason, so to say, it's reasonable to assume that increased actual openness in government behavior, so governments consult more with NGOs when in democratic policies or when going through periods of democratization. Now, you see this incipient democratic reversal, which, it's not my discovery. it is a quite broad, widespread concern recently. You see this incipient democratic reversal since the late 2000s. ironically or not, this is also the time when the new open government discourse has picked up, right? When we're starting the potential of new technologies to involving citizens, and the actual use of new technologies to involve citizens has increased. When you've seen all these mushrooming transparency and open government initiatives, so I said the Open Government Partnership was 2011. The Open Budget Index was, I think, late 90s, but we have it since roughly 2001. The UN e-participation index also 2001. So the 2000s basically are also the time where we started paying more and more attention to these online openness tools. Despite the fact that this is the time when the enthusiasm for these new, if you want, tools or areas of openness has increased, you do not see that much change in terms of actually, for example, opening budgets, or publishing data in open formats, with the caveat that maybe we should give open data a break because it's still very early on. But the open budget advocacy has been going on for a longer time. Now, the e-participation part, which is the one that you'd say, well, that one looks good, right? Possibly, but also one feature of that is that the early adopters of e-participation tools, so remember the ones that the benchmarks are in a sense modeled after, tend to be democracy, but autocracies are catching up. So more and more autocracies are increasingly using online tools to consult citizens, to inform citizens, and so on and so forth. Which leads to a question or a paradox, because I like paradoxes, which is, are we entering an era of so-called autocratic openness? And is it possible that technology can save democracy, which is kind of the techno-optimistic hope in a sense, that even though traditional avenues might be closing a little bit, the new avenues for information participation, all the beautiful things, might be able to compensate for those to some degree. Well, this is the big question, and maybe this should be the next article. But essentially, just from what we know so far about how transparency and participation work, and what technology has to do with it, my take on it is that technology reduces costs of disclosing information or involving citizens, but that does not necessarily change the incentives for disclosure or participation. So, with online tools, assuming enough citizens have access to online technology, which is a big if, and that varies a lot actually within countries, across countries. So you do have the digital divide that you also have to deal with when you're moving all these things online in a sense. But even leaving that aside, even if it's cheaper to, for example, consult citizens, if you have no reason to do it, then that doesn't really change that much in terms of actual consultation. And open government activists do worry about that. So they do worry about what is called open washing. So countries, governments using some of these tools or participating in some of these initiatives as a way to kind of look good to international audiences, maybe get some additional aid money or financing, but without really changing anything in the way the government works, or even worse, while at the same time kind of increasing repression in other areas. And again, you can have some examples. There's also other terms that I love because I love a good metaphor. So zombie transparency has also been used to describe this kind of window dressing, Potemkin e-villages. That's also, I think, a good one. But the idea behind it is the same. It's basically governments just pretending to be open. Now, I do think that it's important when thinking about the potential for technology to save openness to think about, well, what did we learn so far from analog transparency and participation? Because as I said at the beginning, they're not necessarily new. The ideas have been around for a while, right? Including their political justification, including various attempts to, again, inform and involve citizens better. So what do we learn from experiences with analog transparency and participation? Well, they're challenging even under the best of circumstances if we judge them by how much substantive, systemic, sustainable change they actually produce. So it's relatively easy to set up a spontaneous consultation on a topic, but that doesn't necessarily amount to systematic government behavior towards more openness, right? Even FOIAs, which, and again, maybe I'm biased because that's how I started with, and I believe in the right to know. Even FOIAs, while they have had some pretty substantive positive effects by themselves, they cannot change an entire system of governance, right? Transparency advocates have, in their best moments, their most enthusiastic moments, have sold them as, well, sunshine is the best disinfectant. We can transform, citizens can be transformed in armchair auditors, so they're going to use all this data to monitor the performance of government agencies and hold government agencies to account. Well, that is a very demanding thing that you're asking there of the citizens, because most people don't have the time, the interest, or the skills to actually do that. So research, even again, for the best performance, like the performers, like the UK, and the use of open data in the UK, what they show is that, yeah, you have a few journalists, you have a few activists, you have businesses, a lot that use information for their own private purposes, but this army of armchair auditors hasn't really materialized for a variety of reasons. So transparency, participation in whatever form cannot completely change a system of governance. But there is some hope that in good circumstances, even measures that were adopted, for example, without a high level of political support initially, or kind of as a form of open washing, hoping to kind of, here we have a FOIA, leave us alone now. Even those measures can, over time, lead to small incremental changes in government openness, if the conditions are right. So if they manage to gain support over time, and very importantly, if they manage to link up to broader systems of accountability and representation, so broader systems or vision and voice. And the result of this is what you could call a kind of messy politics of openness, where you have NGOs, opposition parties a lot, because they have an interest in embarrassing whoever is in power and just disagreeing with them. So a combination of activists, opposition parties, and so on and so forth, using all these tools to kind of pressure governments to become and stay more open. Now, of course, that still leaves us with the paradox that, okay, if the way this works is you have a kind of messy politics of openness, where you have a bunch of activists and contrarians trying to get more information or influence government decision-making, what explains, or how does this work in more autocratic countries? What explains the adoption of e-participation, e-information initiatives in autocratic countries? Which brings us back to the previous question of, are we entering an era of undemocratic openness? Now, the easiest answer is open washing, right? So governments are just pretending. But there is more and more research that indicates that some autocratic governments are not just pretending. They're actually using these tools as intended to consult and inform citizens on very specific policy issues, right? And China is, I think, the most often held up example here. So, for example, it does have an open government regulation, and while it doesn't work perfectly, no FOIA, no open government regulation works perfectly anywhere, even in the best practices. It has been used to inform and consult citizens in a variety of policy areas, right? So some have even gone as far as calling China an example of authoritarian deliberation, which is also sounds a little bit of a paradox. Why would they do that? Well, one reason to do that, especially for central level governments and high level officials, is that and here we're getting a little bit into technical terms, it reduces information asymmetries between citizens and agencies. But essentially what it allows citizens at the local level to get a better picture of what local governments are doing and report it back to the higher level or other authorities, so that you have kind of fire alarm monitoring if something goes bad. So if the performance of certain government agencies or certain local governments is particularly bad, and there's a risk of local unrest, then there's a way of signaling of signaling these problems early on in order to avoid a radical dissatisfaction. Conversely, consulting citizens in policy decisions, in upcoming policy decisions and policy choices, can also signal if there's a lot of dissatisfaction and lead to some changes in those choices. Again, if and when done right. But this leaves us with the question that even in this best case scenario, does this count as openness or not? Because essentially what happens is governments can use this openness tool, so can selectively inform and consult citizens, but the decision of who gets consulted, who gets informed on what happens with that information still remains with government. And if other avenues of social participation and information are closed, so independent of government, then would you count this as openness or not? Which brings us to kind of the end. So the question I just asked, different formulation is, do controlled transparency and participation still count as open government? I'd say no, but I'm curious about people's thoughts. So where are we now? Well, we can't really turn the clock back on technology unless there's a global catastrophe and we live in a post-apocalyptic world, but that doesn't seem to be happening anytime soon, so we're good. But we can turn back the clock on democracy and global integration. So this model of authoritarian openness is, I'd say, a real possibility. Is there anything that we can do about it? And by we mean public administration researcher, maybe openness advocates, whoever wants to feel included. I am not sure. As I said, this is kind of a little bit of a start. But the basic idea that I'm thinking about is whether it is possible and desired to kind of repoliticize open government, to kind of remember that there's a rights-based discourse at the core of it and at the basis of it, not just the tools and technology-based discourse. And also thinking about giving more attention to institutionalization. For all the faults of FOIA is a legal right, and once it is embedded as a legal right somewhere, even if it doesn't always work out to the best, so to say, citizens have some kind of recourse to demand their right. Again, it doesn't have to go as far as, a rights to, for example, open data, though I could imagine some argument being made of that. But in general, rooting openness in strong legislation rather than directives or agency policies to just make it even more robust. And then partially acknowledging that openness has political roots, and that as much as the technological mirage attracts us to new forms of openness, these political roots are very important if you want kind of not controlled transparency and participation, but openness in a broader sense of an open system, of open government in the sense of a system of governance where citizens have various avenues of interacting with governments, various independent, self-directed avenues of interacting with governments. This is mostly it. We can move to questions and suggestions. I also have a provocative thought to wrap this up. So,
what's your provocative thought?
Well, it's a question. I put it up too fast. So essentially the question was, what is the most successful open government reform in recent memory? And the answer is, and feel free to come up with a different answer, but the answer is glasnost, which that's what it means, right? Openness, transparency. So basically, the policy and practice of more open consultative government and wider dissemination of information initiated by Gorbachev in 1985. So and these might be my personal biases, and I see the puzzled expressions on some of your faces. But essentially, if you think about it, this is what it is. It is open government, both the title and what it was intended to do. The results, we can debate them, what they ended up being. But essentially, I was kind of surprised when I realized, oh, wait, it's the same thing, and we just didn't think about it. Which I think brings me to wrap it up and open it up to questions and discussion. Jacob, yes.
Have you seen any governments, instead of hiding behind like a lack of transparency, hiding behind like a sheer volume of information, where governments are just putting so much data out there for the public that they're able to kind of hide behind that wave?
Yeah, so this is one of the challenges of any kind of transparency, but you know, the technological basis makes it even more easier to kind of just bury the requesters or the public in information that they don't know what to do with. And this is why I also had a separate section on civil society organizations. Now, they're not the only intermediaries. I could add stuff on the media there. I could add stuff on political parties. But in principle, the idea is that you do have to have some kind of information intermediaries, that's also an actual term, that can either kind of say, well, wait a minute, that is not useful in any way, this kind of deluge of untargeted information, or that can take that information and process it and analyze it and kind of prepare it in a way that is more accessible to the citizens. So yeah, that happens, and that is one of the strategies for, I'd say, open washing, right? Where governments or agencies or pretty much anybody can look transparent while not really being transparent. Catherine.
So this reminds me, remember Tina had a conference on governance, international open governance, and Rwanda came up as an example. So I'm going back to your open authoritarianism thing. Because Rwanda, while it's becoming much more authoritarian in many ways, is doing lots of wonderful things with citizen engagement, citizen monitoring with local politicians, access to information, on and on and on. So I think it's really important to point out that tension, and the conversation that ensued had to do with, well, but that's not democracy. But then the people from Rwanda are looking at us oddly, like, well, we vote. So I think your point is very important, connecting this back to a richer definition of democracy and you know, its political roots, because I think in some of those conversations that was completely lost.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I didn't think of Rwanda as one example of authoritarian openness, but I guess you could include it there for the reason that you just named. I think one idea there is that, you know, for example, participation, consultation, all of these things, they're not necessarily incompatible with autocratic regimes, right? Many autocratic regimes have systems for, you know, participation, consultation, and so on. Now, and this is where I'm kind of veering off the paper itself. I'm not entirely sure when they work and when they don't work, right? So you also have a lot of example of participation, consultation, and so on in autocratic system, and in democratic systems that is just that, pretending, right? So we set up a meeting, invited some people, had a nice chat, and then everybody went home and felt consulted, or not, we don't care, but we kind of played the part. But the bigger question is, and maybe Rwanda is also a good example of that, it is also entirely possible that you have an autocratic government where they say, no, we actually take this participation thing seriously. So we have a new policy decision coming up. We, do a poll, whether online or offline. We invite people in participatory planning meetings at the local level. And, if the result is convenient, we do actually take into account what they decide, so to say. So that's entirely possible. The big distinction here, I think, is whether there is a choice or there isn't a choice on the side of citizens to actually do that, right? And not just in a positive way, as in you have to participate in the meeting. And in communist times, that's how it was, right? So you had basically coerced participation and patriotic duty. And it's not just whether citizens are, in a sense, forced to participate in these meetings, but also if they're allowed to have their own meetings independent of who is in power, right? And that's where the breakdown is, I think. That's where the question is, well, if the degree and the locus and the form of openness is decided by the government completely, does it count as open?
So earlier in the presentation, you mentioned that it's not enough to simply put the data out there. You also have to kind of interpret it and explain what's going on. Don't you think that in doing that, it's less objective if the government is telling people what this data means and what the implications are? Don't you think it might be better to leave that up to the media or to citizen groups to kind of do that interpretation themselves?
Yeah, no, in principle, yes. I mean, and that's the philosophy behind many transparency initiatives, both old and new. But especially for the open data philosophy, that's the idea that government shouldn't interpret the data for you. You should be allowed to interpret it yourself, right? So this is why the data that should be published should be very disaggregated, as raw as possible, and in a format that allows easier use, right? So that is the philosophy, that somebody else. Now, the question is whether there is a somebody else, and whether that somebody else is allowed to do that, right? Because without that condition, there's no point to it, right? Now, me personally, I do think so for people, just in case there is no somebody else, and for people that are not necessarily so enthusiastic about wading through all the data, it might not be bad if government managed also to communicate something in a more clear and understandable way, right? And the other meanings of transparency, the more esoteric ones, if you want, they're not just about, here is a bunch of data, to put it dramatically. They're about, well, transparency is also about understanding how decisions are made and why. So that's not necessarily kind of just putting the data out there, but giving a reasoned justification for decisions. There is one thing if the government alone does this, and then it also can get very easily propaganda, so to say. But it is different if this reasoned debate actually includes some communication with a bunch of other actors. So in a sense, wherever you go from this, okay, we start with, there's a bunch of data, there is raw data, everybody can use it, and then what? Does this constitute openness? Wherever you go, you end up, well, you need all kinds of intermediaries, you need people that are able to process data, you need some kind of dialogue about what's going on and why. So it increases to something that's much broader than publishing data.
So how many countries do you include in your research?
So I don't look.
Trend?
Yeah, so I don't look specifically at countries. I bring in some countries as an example, but essentially the data is global data. So not all the databases include quite all the countries in the world. Trust me, it gets complicated when you start to work with country data because you have to debate whether you need to include Monaco and the Vatican or not. But it's true. No offense to, but essentially, kind of, most of them cover 100 countries upward.
But I wonder whether like authoritarian countries and democracies have different patterns. I feel like America is getting more and more open, but China, no matter how data the government release, I feel like it's controlled transparency, as you say, and I feel like it's actually more and more away from democracy defined by.
Well, again, another way to frame this is if the original question was, is there a global openness trend or are governments becoming more open? Well, it depends how you define openness, right? Mm-hmm. Based on the definition that you choose, you could say, even for the US, you could make an argument that it's not becoming more open, it's becoming more closed in some ways.
So why? I'm not an expert in that. I feel like America is getting more open.
Well, and then I would ask you, so how do you define open? So more open in what way?
For me, it's completely intuitive. I don't do any research in that area. I was looking at actually last week, and I was watching the movie The Post. So I was, I'm thinking, whether Washington Post could use the Pentagon paper or not. Back in 1960s, 70s, they couldn't. This case has to be brought up to the Supreme Court to decide. And now we know, based on the Freedom of Information Act, yes, they could use that. So I feel like the government is more and more open.
Well, so I mean, if we're talking, for example, specifically about FOIA, about the Freedom of Information Act, right, you have the law and in law versus in practice gap everywhere, not just, you know. And the thing is, even if you look at the US, compliance with the FOIA changes over time a lot, right? So you have large backlogs under some administrations, you have smaller backlogs under other administration. The Obama presidency started with saying, we will be the most open administration in US history, right? And it did rollback. Too close, words are too close. It did roll back some provisions of the Bush administrations that restricted sharing information for the public. So the Bush administration was, kind of in terms of orientation, was more restrictive in terms of what's shared with the public. The Obama administration reversed that to some degree and tried to reverse that and did a lot in terms of open government. Partially that's where the term open government comes from, right? From the Open Government Directive that Obama issued on his first day in office, right? The Open Government Partnership that the US helped co-found under President Obama. So a lot of the term and the discourse comes from there. How solidified and sustainable is this? Well, that's a little bit debatable because directives can be undone very easily by every new president if they don't like them, or every new administration if they don't like them. Data, so going back to open data, putting data, it's as easy to take data sets offline as to put them. No, it's easier, sorry, correction. It's easier to take data sets offline than to put them online, so to say. And there's been, and again, this is not a paper on the US specifically, and I'm not comparing US and China or anything like that. But just reading in the popular press, there's been quite some scandals, outrage among openness and transparency activists about the current administration taking offline data sets that activists thought were important, but that the administration didn't really think the public should have access to. And then you go back to the FOIA. This is what I say. I mean, maybe I am biased, but I think I have a good argument why the FOIA and FOIAs in general are so important, because you can go back to there is a legal right and the government is legally required to disclose this data. Of course, that's not easy, and it doesn't happen automatically, and you have to go to litigation, and you need an independent judicial system, and. But at the end, you still have something more solid than a directive or a memo, or we're just gonna, try to look good by disclosing some things or others. And by the way, and this ended up being a long answer that's more focused on the US than I wanted to. Speaking of the Obama presidency, fun stuff you discover while you do research. Apparently, Jon Stewart made fun, so to say, or produced one of his incisive pieces about the, don't want to say open washing, but the not quite consistency of the Obama administration in being transparent. About apparently that they got, I didn't get to watch the video because I was too worried, that they, received the Transparency Award, but the ceremony wasn't open to the press, which is quite, quite paradoxical, right? So I still have to see that video. But essentially, yes, if you're talking about, even in the best case scenario, and you can take the US and the UK as the best case scenario, right? You can add Canada in, and I probably need to look at Singapore because I think Singapore might be an interesting example of autocratic openness, if you want. But essentially, if you take the best examples of openness in this new sense, it's not bad, but it's muddy and it's a battle. It's not here we are, right? Now, this ended up being a very long answer.
Yeah, so we actually are out of time. But if you want to stick around for a
Sure.
few minutes, maybe we could ask some more questions. But I want to thank you all for coming. Let's please join me in giving her one more round of applause.